All right. The alert didn't arrive the way alerts are supposed to arrive. It didn't come through a scheduled briefing, a prepared statement, a carefully managed news cycle with designated spokespeople positioned at podiums, with talking points cleared through 3 layers of communication staff. It came the way the worst institutional crises always come, sideways, through a channel nobody was monitoring at the right moment, at a time when the people who needed to be managing it were managing something else entirely. And by the time the right phones started ringing inside Mar-a-Lago's operational orbit, the story had already been out for 1 hour and 47 minutes. What that story said didn't just create a problem for Pam Bondi. It created a problem for the architecture of trust that the entire Department of Justice operation under this administration had been constructed around. Not a political problem, though it is that. Not a messaging problem, though the communications team is treating it as one. A structural problem. The kind that doesn't resolve itself through a clarifying statement, or a strategic Friday afternoon document release, or a surrogate deployed to 3 cable hits with a unified counter-narrative. The kind that embeds itself in institutional records and congressional correspondence and inspector general intake queues, and doesn't leave those places just because the news cycle has moved to the next thing. I've been tracking this since the first confirmation came through. What's happening inside the Bondi Justice Department right now is not what the public framing of this crisis is describing. And the distance between the public framing and the operational reality is the distance that no one covering this week's emergency has been willing to walk all the way across. Here is what that walk actually looks like. The Bondi appointment was always a calculated bet. Anyone with genuine familiarity with how Attorney General confirmations interact with the institutional culture of the Justice Department understood that from the beginning. The department doesn't absorb political leadership the way cabinet agencies built for political leadership absorb it. It has career infrastructure, the kind that predates administrations, survives administrations, and in certain documented historical instances, outlasts administrations in ways that become their own chapters in institutional memory. Political appointees arrive. Career officials watch. The dynamic that develops between those two facts determines whether a Justice Department tenure produces durable results or produces a record that subsequent investigations pick through looking for the pressure points. Bondi arrived with a specific mandate. That mandate was understood by everyone in proximity to the decision-making that produced her appointment. It wasn't hidden. It was the explicit terms of the job she accepted. And in the months since her confirmation cleared, the public architecture of what she was doing with that mandate, the statements, the priority announcements, the prosecutorial direction signals sent through internal memoranda and public remarks, looked, from the outside, like an operation functioning within the parameters the appointment established. What the public architecture concealed is what this week's emergency is actually about. The crisis has multiple layers, and the coverage of it has been collapsing those layers into a single narrative framing that flattens what is actually a compound institutional problem into something that cable news can fit between commercial breaks. To understand what is actually happening, the layers have to be separated and examined individually, because each one carries weight that the others don't carry, and the compound effect of all of them landing in the same week is what transformed a developing institutional tension into an emergency designation inside the political operation that depends on the Justice Department functioning in a particular way. The first layer is the prosecutorial direction problem. Inside the department, there are documented tensions, documented in ways that mean they exist in, written form in places that congressional oversight mechanisms can reach. Between the political leadership's directive priorities and the professional judgment of career prosecutors who's institutional. Function, requires them to evaluate cases on evidentiary standards that don't negotiate with political calendars. That tension is not unique to this administration. It appears in the institutional record of justice departments across multiple administrations in both parties. What makes the current version of it structurally significant is the specificity of the documented disagreements and the rank of the career officials whose written objections are now sitting in files that oversight committees are actively working toward. When a Deputy Assistant Attorney General puts a disagreement in writing, that document doesn't disappear when the disagreement is overruled. It sits in the institutional record. It becomes a data point in the pattern analysis that congressional investigators and inspector general reviews are specifically designed to conduct. It becomes, if enough similar documents accumulate from enough similar officials across enough similar episodes, the evidentiary foundation of something considerably more serious than an internal management dispute. The accumulation is what this week's emergency is about. The second layer is the congressional exposure problem, and this is the layer that the Trump camp is treating with the most visible urgency, because it's the layer that operates on the fastest timeline with the least controllable variables. They are two separate committee inquiries, one in the Senate, one in the House, operating on parallel tracks with different jurisdictional emphases, but overlapping documentary interests, that have been building toward document requests of sufficient specificity to create real institutional problems for the political leadership at Main Justice. Those requests aren't fishing expeditions constructed around theories. They're built on sourced information. The people providing that information to congressional staff have institutional standing, documentary access, and professional incentives that make their cooperation with oversight mechanisms structurally durable in ways that are difficult for the political operation to interrupt. The specific documents both committees are moving toward concern the communications record around a set of prosecutorial decisions made between October and February. Not the decisions themselves. The communications record around them. The emails. The meeting logs. The documentation of who was in the room when the direction was given, and what the career professionals in that room said in response, and how those responses were handled. That communications record, if it reaches committee staff in the form that the sourcing suggests it exists in, creates a public accountability exposure that transforms the current phase of this crisis into a considerably more consequential next phase. That's what the emergency alert is actually about. The calendar calculation that someone inside the political operation ran, the one that produced the alarm, isn't about this week's coverage. It's about what this week's coverage signals about the timeline on which that documentary record is going to become a committee problem. And the calculation produced a number that nobody wanted to see. The third layer is the one that the public framing of this crisis has been most systematically avoiding. It concerns Bondi herself, not her political positioning, not her media performance, not the cable news assessments of whether she's effectively defending the administration's agenda in public forums. It concerns her operational relationship with the institutional infrastructure of the department she leads. And the specific dimension of that relationship that has become the crisis driver in the current moment is a dimension that her public presentation has been carefully constructed to obscure. The department's career senior leadership, the people at the levels where institutional knowledge and professional judgment intersect with actual operational authority, have been operating under a working understanding of where the lines are. That working understanding developed over months through a process of institutional negotiation that is never formal, never documented in ways that produce clean evidentiary records, but is entirely real as an organizational fact. The political leadership wants certain outcomes. The career infrastructure has certain non-negotiable professional requirements. The working understanding represents the negotiated space between those two sets of constraints where the institution can actually function. That working understanding has broken down. The breakdown is what the Trump camp is responding to with emergency-level urgency. Not because the breakdown is publicly visible in a form that produces immediate political damage. It isn't. Or at least it wasn't until this week. But because the consequences of a broken working understanding inside the Justice Department don't stay invisible. They move. They migrate from internal institutional dysfunction into documented professional disagreement. From documented professional disagreement into congressional source networks. From congressional source networks into oversight committee inquiry tracks. And from oversight committee inquiry tracks into the kind of public accountability exposure that the emergency alert was trying to process. The people who ran the calendar calculation understand where that migration leads. They've watched it happen before. The specific architecture of how Justice Department internal problems become Justice Department public problems is not a mystery to practitioners who have spent careers at the intersection of executive branch operations and congressional oversight. And the alarm they're running now is the alarm that practitioners sound when the migration is already underway, and the only remaining question is how far it travels before the exposure becomes controllable or it doesn't. I've spent time with 4 sources who have technical authority on what the institutional breakdown inside the Bondi Justice Department means and where the current crisis trajectory leads. What they told me is not what the public framing of this emergency is saying. It is more specific, more structurally grounded, and more consequential than anything the cable news treatment of this crisis has managed to communicate. A former senior DOJ official who served across 2 administrations and has maintained active professional relationships inside the current department's career infrastructure. What you're watching right now is the 3rd act of a story that started in the confirmation process. The institutional problems that are generating this emergency were visible to anyone paying attention to the right signals from the moment the political direction of the department's priority structure became clear. Career officials don't announce their concerns publicly. They express them through the documented channels that the institution creates for exactly that purpose. When those channels stop producing the outcomes the officials documenting their concerns believe the professional standards require, the documentation accumulates in ways that have downstream consequences that are very difficult to interrupt. That accumulation is what the political operation is responding to. The emergency is that the accumulation reached a threshold that moved it from manageable internal tension to active oversight exposure. A constitutional law scholar with extensive background in executive branch accountability mechanisms and separation of powers litigation. The specific legal exposure that the current situation creates is connected to a doctrine that the public discussion of this crisis hasn't engaged with directly. When political leadership at an executive agency directs operational outcomes in ways that produce documented objections from career officials whose professional function is to apply non-political standards, and when that direction is documented in the communications record in a form that congressional investigators can access through oversight mechanisms, the legal exposure that creates is not simply a political problem. It is a question of whether the documented conduct is legally defensible under the frameworks that govern executive branch operations. That question is now live in this situation in a way that it wasn't 60 days ago. And live legal questions about documented executive conduct are not questions that messaging operations resolve. A veteran political operative with experience managing crises of comparable institutional weight inside Republican administrations across 3 decades, who requested that specific identifying details be limited. The emergency response you're seeing from the Trump political operation is a response to a specific calculation failure. The assumption that drove the operational decisions that produced the current crisis was that the institutional infrastructure of the Justice Department would absorb political direction in the way that political appointees typically expect institutions to absorb direction. That assumption was wrong in a way that the political operation understood at a theoretical level, but didn't fully internalize at an operational level until the current evidence landed. The distance between understanding something theoretically and internalizing it operationally is the distance between a manageable institutional negotiation and a full-scale emergency alert. They're now on the wrong side of that distance. A former appellate litigator with significant experience in cases involving executive branch conduct and institutional accountability, who has been tracking the documentary record that the oversight inquiries are building toward. The document set that the congressional committees are working toward is structured around a specific evidentiary theory. That theory doesn't require proving intent. It requires demonstrating pattern. The communications record that exists, and the sourcing on its existence is solid, is sufficient to demonstrate pattern in a way that intent becomes legally and politically less relevant than the documented sequence of decisions and the documented responses of the professionals. Those decisions ran through. Pattern evidence in oversight investigations is the category of evidence that survives the longest and travels the farthest. It doesn't respond to individual statement corrections or clarifying releases or personnel adjustments. It sits in the record and it accumulates meaning as each subsequent development adds another data point to the sequence. That's what the emergency is actually about. The pattern is visible now in a way it wasn't before, and visibility changes the political physics of what happens next. Here is precisely where this crisis stands as the response operation runs its current phase, and the decisions that will determine the next phase get made in the rooms that don't appear on public schedules. The communications response has activated across 3 simultaneous tracks. The public track is running a unified framing designed to characterize the emerging institutional accountability exposure as a partisan attack operation. Coordinated opponents using oversight mechanisms as political weapons rather than as legitimate accountability instruments. That framing reaches the audience it's designed for effectively. It doesn't reach the oversight committees, which don't make evidentiary judgments on the basis of the political framing deployed against their inquiries. The legal track is operating in spaces that don't produce public statements. Attorneys with executive branch representation experience are evaluating the documentary exposure the communications record creates in developing, the framework for what a defensive posture looks like if and when the committee inquiries reach the document request stage that the current trajectory points toward. That evaluation is the most consequential work happening inside the crisis response right now. It determines whether the legal architecture around the Bondi operation can be constructed in a form that withstands the oversight mechanisms that are moving toward it. The personnel track is the one that the public framing of the crisis has been most careful about. There are conversations happening about the specific individuals whose documented objections represent the most significant nodes of exposure in the institutional record. What those conversations are producing, whether they produce the kinds of outcomes that remove those individuals from the positions they currently occupy, and the institutional access that makes their cooperation with oversight mechanisms structurally durable, is the variable that the political operation is most actively trying to manage right now. Federal employment protections create constraints on what that management can look like. Those constraints are well understood by both sides of the dynamic, which means the personnel conversations are taking place inside a set of legal and institutional guardrails that limit what the political operation can actually accomplish through them. And those limits are themselves part of what the oversight committees are watching. The emergency alert that hit the Trump camp this week isn't the end of this story. It isn't even the end of this chapter. What it is, with the specificity that the sourcing on the current situation supports, is the moment when the institutional crisis that has been developing inside the Bondi Justice Department since the first week of the appointment crossed the threshold from manageable internal tension to active public accountability exposure. That crossing has a direction. Accountability exposure at this stage of an institutional crisis doesn't move backward. It doesn't respond to communications operations or personnel adjustments or political framing in ways that reduce the evidentiary record that the oversight mechanisms are building toward. It responds to legal arguments and documentary positions and institutional negotiations that happen in places that don't generate cable news coverage. And the quality of what happens in those places, the legal sophistication of the defensive architecture, the institutional judgment of the people constructing it, the accuracy of the assessment about what the oversight mechanisms are, actually building toward and what they're likely to find when they get there, determines whether the current emergency phase of this crisis represents a contained institutional problem or the beginning of something structurally larger. The pattern evidence that the appellate litigator described is sitting in the documentary record. The oversight inquiry timelines are running on calendars that the political operation doesn't control. The career officials whose documented objections represent the institutional foundation of what's coming aren't going anywhere. The congressional source networks that turned internal dysfunction into oversight inquiry traction are still active and still receiving. None of that changes based on what the emergency response operation deploys in the next 72 hours. The institutional record doesn't negotiate with the messaging architecture constructed around it. The oversight mechanisms don't calibrate their timelines to the political operations crisis management needs. The documentary evidence that exists doesn't disappear because the framing deployed against it describes it as politically motivated. The documents are the documents. The record is the record. The crisis is running. What happens next inside the Bondi Justice Department in the next 30 to 60 days will determine whether this week's emergency alert becomes the highest point of institutional pressure in this story, or whether it becomes a footnote in the account of how the pressure built to something considerably more consequential. The decisions being made right now in the legal conversations, in the personnel deliberations, in the strategic assessments of where the oversight timelines are actually heading, will produce that determination in ways that the public framing of the crisis will describe after the fact, but cannot shape in advance. The people making those decisions are working with information that the public narrative around this emergency isn't carrying. They know what the documentary record shows. They know where the oversight inquiries are heading. They know what the career officials who are cooperating with those inquiries are in a position to document and demonstrate. They're making strategic calculations about institutional survival with that knowledge as the baseline. And the quality of those calculations, not the quality of the cable hits or the social media responses or the political framing, is what the next phase of this story turns on. The emergency is live. The record is building. The oversight mechanisms are moving on timelines that nobody on the political side of this crisis controls. And the 30 days that follow this week's alert are the 30 days that determine whether the story that started with an appointment made as a calculated bet ends as a chapter in institutional resilience or as a case study in how justice departments break when the gap between political direction and professional standards widens past the point where the institutional infrastructure can absorb the pressure. Stay in this. Subscribe. Notifications on. Because the document request that eventually lands at Main Justice is the moment when everything that has been building inside this crisis becomes publicly legible in a form that the framing operations on every side of it will have to respond to with the actual record rather than the characterization of the record. The alert went out. The rooms are active. The clock is running. I'll be here when the next document